What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video we'd be doing something a little bit different. We are going to be diving into mono red here. We're going to be doing a little bit of a meta breakdown, talk about why mono red is like one of the decks that you see to be pretty popular in best of one, talk about the various things like that, kind of break down some things if you are new to Magic or are very unfamiliar with what currently is happening in the standard meta as we roll into the new year. As I'm going to be doing maybe a couple videos over the next couple weeks, we're going to be talking about the next, like, you know, we'll talk about like the top 5, top 6 played decks in the current standard meta, breaking down each one of the decks, talk about the pluses and minuses of each and how they interact with one another as you do climb the ladder in MTG Arena. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button to be notified when I post videos like this onto the channel. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out the channel also out a lot. But that being said, let's dive into the meta breakdown and talk about mono red. So mono red is a deck that has been a while in MTG Arena, and it's pretty well established when it comes to actually being a deck that you will see a lot in the ladder as you climb MTG Arena standard, and there's a good reason for it. With it being a deck that's been around, it's definitely been pretty fine-tuned in a way. Even since rotation, it's pretty much found its place back in the top of the meta as a whole, and overall it really isn't creating any new tricks that it hasn't done before. It did lose a few cards with rotation, but other than that, it definitely gained a few tools as well to pay off. The benefits of playing something like mono red is actually it's definitely a very strong deck, especially when you're on the play, especially in best of one. You know, definitely getting out to swinging in for that 1 point of damage on turn 1 and your opponent can't do anything is definitely very good. The other thing too, it has a great curve. It has many cards that you can definitely hit on curve to kind of, you know, get ahead of your opponent in that sense, making your opponent having to pretty much play catch up in the early games of the game. Next thing to follow that, it is definitely established. It is one of those decks that if you've been playing MTG Arena for a while, you probably have collected a good chunk of these cards if you've dabbled in mono red or just been from open packs. It is definitely one of those decks that have just been around for a while, as it is a good chunk of it is actually from Throne of Eldraine. So if you've been playing since then, you definitely probably have a few of these cards already in your collection. The other thing about the deck overall is it's actually a pretty simple deck to pick up. It's nothing too challenging in what it's trying to do. It pretty much hits you in the face, hits your opponent in the face, I should say, as hard as possible and as quick as possible. Sure, I mean, things have changed in a slight bit just because the meta has changed as a whole, but overall, I mean, the general concept is we're trying to hit our opponent in the face, get their life total as low as possible, and win the game that way. The other benefit of playing something like mono red is actually the games are super quick. I mean, especially when you're on a good play and your opponent's not really doing so hot, you can definitely finish games in a few minutes, especially if you're definitely drawing pretty well and your opponent isn't roping you out to stall the game a little bit. With that being said, let's move on to some of the weaknesses. You know, every deck is not 100% win guaranteed the whole time. I mean, sure, you can advertise a deck could be 100% win, but every deck has a weakness in some form or way. The first one up, I mean, the one downfall to mono red is the fact that if your opponent's gaining life and you have nothing to do to slow them down from gaining that life, that is definitely going to be one of the downfalls. I mean, it's going to be kind of counteracting what you're doing, because a lot of your creatures, sure, they may be able to hit your opponent really quick, but they're not doing a lot of big damage until like the mid game. Follow that up. The other thing too, a lot of our creatures aren't very large. The majority of them are fairly small. Sure, we have a few burn spells and a few pump spells and also Embercleave, but overall our creatures aren't the toughest guys on the block. You put a giant creature like, you know, let's just say a Lovestruck Beast, but you haven't really drawn anything to get through a Lovestruck Beast. Now your opponent has a 5/5 Lovestruck Beast that you really can't get through. The other thing too is if the games start to go a little bit longer, mono red is more of an early game aggro deck. The goal is if it's trying to finish you off by turn 5, turn 6 at the latest, the best idea is you finish off your opponent on turn 4 with like an Annex and an Embercleave. But the overall goal is turn 5, turn 6 is kind of where we're kind of wrapping the game up. So if the game goes a lot longer than that, mono red kind of does fizzle out in that sense. The other thing too is if you know, mono red wants to keep on hitting things to throw at our opponent. If you're kind of drawn into a bunch of lands, flooding in this deck is not very good because we only have a lot of things to really dig a little bit deeper into our library to kind of draw more cards to keep on the momentum. The other thing too with that, it's not very good in traditional Magic in the sense that it doesn't perform as well as it does in best of one. So if you did decide to play this in either your local tournament at your own local game store or even a traditional Magic on MTG Arena, it's not one of the strong decks currently in the meta as a whole for traditional Magic. I think it's more so because it's a very explosive deck. It definitely can win a game one, but when it comes to sideboard and stuff, I think a lot of decks definitely can, outmaneuver mono red when it comes to that part. Mono red is in a weird way a one-trick pony. So I will say in those type of matches, mono red is probably not the choice I would take in that things. Now to go over on how do you win with mono red. I mean, the overall concept is pretty straightforward. I mean, I don't know if you can just see by looking at this or if you already do know, but mono red has three main conditions on how it wants to win against your opponent. One, we want to hit as quickly as possible and as hard as possible with all our haste creatures and pump spells and things like that. Getting an Annex out on turn 3 with having 2 creatures out prior to it. Annex is already at like a 4/3. Definitely a good thing, and it definitely makes it hard for our opponent to start removing our creatures off the board without us getting plus our little 1/1s like that. Throw in a Castle Embereth. We definitely start getting a wider on our opponent, pumping all our creatures, swinging in that way, doing the traditional, we're just going to take the creatures and swing at our opponent's face. The next thing up is we can also play Torbrand. Torbrand is a card that makes all our red sources, if they deal damage to an opponent or permanent opponent does control, it deals that much damage +2 instead. So essentially it makes all our creatures essentially +2 in strength stronger, as well as our spells that we could throw at our opponent's creatures and or their face. So it could pretty much win the game in that way, because now our creatures are just doing that much more damage. The next interesting one, if you don't know or have been underneath a rock in a hot minute, is actually Embercleave. Embercleave is just that big old finisher. You just have that feeling that when your opponent swings in and there's that hinge where it's like they hold priority, you just know what's about to happen. And Embercleave is just one of those big old finishers. It's a flash spell if you don't know what it is. It is a flash spell that can be played at any time. This costs 1 less for each attacking creature we control, so essentially you're not playing this on your main phase or second main phase, you're playing this right on your attack step. And then you swing in, depending on how many creatures that you swing in with, Embercleave discounted that many colorless, and then essentially you get to attach it to a target creature you control for free, giving that creature +1/+1 and double strike and trample. So essentially taking any of your creatures that either if it's unblocked or blocked by something maybe even bigger, essentially making your creature just this big steam bulldozer that's coming straight at your opponent's face to hopefully finish them off. Combine that with something like Annex on turn 3, play that on turn 4, that's already 4 devotion plus whatever you also have on the battlefield. Essentially making an Annex just pretty much the guy that's going to finish the game on your opponent. It definitely makes it hard for your opponent to kind of deal with that. The other thing too, when we think about the deck, is how do you want to go about properly sequencing your turns so that you can hopefully get to your end game as quickly as possible. So be open in hand, you probably want to draw something like 3 lands and some early game spells. So you probably want to see if you have a 1-drop, either Fervent Champion or in this case a Hellhound as being one of your possible 1-drops. I would play the Hellhound if you have both in your hand, just because the Hellhound you want to establish on turn 1, then on turn 2 you can already swing it for 2, plus then you play the Fervent Champion, maybe leave mana open for a shock or something like that, or even Rimrock Knight pump spell. The next thing you want to probably do on turn 2 is if you play one of those but you don't have the other, you either want to play Robber of the Rich, leave open mana for a Bone Crusher Giant Burn if your opponent has played a creature in response, or even leave mana open in general, just play like a Fire Prophecy, or even just play a Rimrock Knight straight out, even without pumping your Fervent Champion or something like that. The one benefit is with Fervent Champion and Rimrock Knight's a Dwarf Knight and Fervent Champion's a Knight, and Fervent Champion will be able to buff your opponent's knights with its ability whenever it attacks, so essentially making Rimrock Knight that much tougher of a creature to prevent, to swing in. So on turn 3 you'll be essentially swinging it for 4 damage with your Rimrock Knight. So that is possible turn 2 play. Turn 3 you can see all our turn 3 cards. The goal here is hopefully hitting an Annex on turn 3. Worst case scenario, if you've already burned your opponent in the face or the creature with the Bone Crusher Giant spell ability, you can also throw the Bone Crusher Giant onto the battlefield for 3 as well, or even a Phoenix of Ash in the air, 2/2 flyer, flying haster that can be pumped in the later game when you have open mana is definitely a good card, essentially allowing you to kind of swing in over your opponent's creatures. Then on turn 4, the ideal, this is where we kind of want to start hitting our end game essentially already. We want to hit either the Torbrand, we want to hit the Embercleave, We have possibly at this point, if we played a Castle Embereth as one of our mana sources, we have mana open for that to use that as a pump. And a new thing that's been kind of added, as you if you have been paying attention to what Mono Red's been playing, we have Aggro in War, which is a very interesting spell just because you get to gain control of target creature as long as this is on the battlefield. Until your next turn, creatures your opponent's control attack, forcing them to attack, and then each type creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So this is a new saga that's been kind of coming out and about in the meta as a whole, helping Mono Red get kind of through some of those tougher matchups. Phoenix of Ash is actually another card I should point out as well that's definitely good against rogues in the sense that we can escape it, essentially slimming our graveyard enough to hopefully get us back underneath 8 cards in our graveyard and then regain it back on the battlefield if our opponent has spot removaled it. To sum all that up, I mean, the deck doesn't really contain too much more in depth of what it's really trying to do. Like I said, it is kind of like a one-trick pony. Everything's going in at your opponent's face. The land base is pretty straightforward. I mean, even if you don't have, the Castle Embereth, you can just play 24 mountains. And here on the side, I have a couple other things that you can also play that you can also try out depending on how you feel, how the deck plays out. If you don't want to play the Hellhound, you can always play the Firebreak Charger as another 1-drop that came out as Zendikar Rising, and as long as it's equipped, it has haste, but whenever it dies, it actually deals damage equal to its power to any target. So essentially making it kind of awkward for opponent to block into it if it does become stronger. Kargan Intimidator is another interesting 2-drop. It's one of those more interesting ones if you want to go super aggressive, maybe drop some Fire Prophecies or something like that, and just go into with the creatures. Pretty much he has 3 abilities that you pay 1 mana for that gives him +1/+1. Target creature becomes a coward into the turn, and then cowards can't block warriors if you don't know that. And then another one, you can also give him trample to end a turn, or target warrior gets trampled end a turn. He's, I think, the only warrior in the deck, so essentially he'd be the one getting trample. Then we have Ox of Argonis. This is something that is a little bit interesting here. It kind of is one of those very interesting things that you can maybe, if you don't want to play a Crone War, you can always play Ox. It's a 5-drop for 2. It doesn't seem very great, but the thing about it is it's one of the ways that we can throw some card draw in the deck, and it has an escape ability for 2 mana. If we have 8 other cards in the graveyard, we can pay 2 mana and escape it for the +1/+1 counter. And then we get Shatter Skull Smashing. This is another card that we could play as maybe a possible burn spell. The other thing, it's a modal land, so we can always play it as a modal land into play tapped or untapped by paying 3 life. But essentially we can now target 2 creatures or planeswalkers and deal X damage to each one of them. And if we pay 6 or more, it deals double the damage divided as we choose among them. So some interesting cards you can definitely try out if depending on what you feel like playing, or based on how your matchups are, you can definitely adjust the list on that manner. With that being said, I mean, is the deck worth building if you are a player who's just trying to figure out what to play maybe in the current meta and you're unsure? I would say yes. It's overall pretty cheap to make. Sure, there's a lot of rares based on this list, but I do have a budget version that I will show you right after I'm done going over this. And it's also, like I said, it's as the deck is straightforward on what it's trying to do. It's a pretty good new player deck. It doesn't have too many interesting interactions that you really could, screw up. Essentially, you just play creatures and swing it to face, and essentially, leave mana open to either play a couple pump spells like the Rimrock Knight, some burn spells to get rid of your opponent's creatures that are maybe in your way, and then to finish off your opponent just by playing the Giant Embercleave. With that being said, I mean, it is definitely a good deck to play. It's definitely efficient at what it's trying to do, and when you go from here, you can always evolve and go into something a little bit more complex by adjusting to some other colors. So to show you the budget deck, now the budget deck is a little bit different what it's trying to do. I mean, overall, this is another best of 1 deck. I do have this listed, I think, somewhere down here. This one's a little bit more burn focused on what it's trying to do, but overall it's kind of generally doing the same concept. I don't think there's a single rare in the deck, so that is one of those things. But this is something you can start out with in a mono red way and then build your way to possibly, building into the full-fledged mono red deck. I think I had another one, I can't remember where the list is. It may be somewhere on my Aether Hub, which I'll have links for all these things in the video description down below if you want to check that out. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out the channel a lot. If you want to be notified when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I will catch you in the next video.